Yeah, and we got a good group. All right. I believe we're at the bottom of 328 as well. So I'll just jump in. Thank all of you for joining us on this lovely Tuesday as we continue reading through Chapter 4, Section 4 of Anti-Oedipus, the section on the first positive task of schizoanalysis. We have been already diving through a bunch of pages, and it is going to be a slow go because a lot of this stuff is, as you've been hearing us ramble about, not the easiest to take in. And none of us here are already Deleuzian scholars, and there's a lot of questions we have. So hopefully you don't mind too much discussion, but thank you all for joining us. I'm going to first open up to, did anyone have any epiphanies over the earlier section, the earlier part of this section last night that they want to go over today, or should I just dive right into the text?
In regards to coding and codification and the second synthesis?
Or really anything regarding, because we went over so many things already. I'm going to guess that's a no. Fair enough. Then I'll go ahead and I'll begin reading. Bottom of 328. It would seem that the genetic code points to a genie decoding. One need only grasp the decoding and deterritorialization functions in their own positivity, inasmuch as they imply a particular chain state that is metastable and distinct both from any axiomatic and from any code. The molecular chain is the form in which the genie unconscious... Is it genie? Is it supposed to be genic?
Genic.
God damn, this PDF. A genic decoding. Why genie... I kind of like the visual, but that doesn't work. The molecular chain is the form in which the genic unconscious, always remaining subject, reproduces itself. And as we have seen, that is the primary inspiration of psychoanalysis. It does not add a code to all those that are already known. The signifying chain of the unconscious, Newman, is not used to discover or decipher codes of desire, but to cause absolutely decoded flows of desire, libido, to circulate, and to discover in desire that which scrambles all the codes and undoes all the territorialities. It is true that Oedipus will restore psychoanalysis to the state of a simple code, with the familial territoriality and the signifier of castration. Worse yet, it will happen that psychoanalysis itself wants to act as an axiomatic, which is the famous turning point where it no longer even relates to the familial scene, but solely to the psychoanalytic scene that supposedly answers for its own truth. And to the psychoanalytic operation that supposedly answers for its own success. The couch as an axiomatized earth, the axiomatic of the cure as a successful castration. But by recording or axiomatizing the flows of desire in this way, psychoanalysis makes a molar use of the signifying chain that results in a misappreciation of all the syntheses of the unconscious. We probably should just take a moment just to go over quickly the last few paragraphs. They've been talking about the symbolic chain, the signifying chain, the molecular chain. They've been having this discussion, basically trying to pull, in my reading, sort of Lacanian and Freudian psychoanalytics and trying to talk about where this chain and how it functions. Is that fair to everyone? Is my mic working?
Probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
The consensus is probably.
I'll take probably. But it's I mean, we're going to spend a lot of time in the review at this point, for sure, having this discussion about what this literally means. But we'll start with this. What is this paragraph about? Like, this is that, I think, Alyosha, is this what you've been talking about? This same thing where it's like, cool, I'm completely missing the thread. My fingers are not on the pulse of this. I feel like that throughout this entire one. For fuck's sake, I was saying genie, for Christ's sake.
You ain't never gonna have a code like me. I actually think this section is more akin to the previous section, so it's not that bad to me. It's the next few, like starting on 329 onwards, where I think we start getting into things like zero intensity and stuff like that. That is gonna require a lot more. But in this one, I mean, having read through the end of the section, this thing of the genic unconscious always remaining subject. They've talked about that a bunch before, but towards the end of the chapter, they talk about is it the partial objects, the body without organs, and then the part produced on the side that corresponding to connective, disjunctive, and conjunctive, and the part produced on the side is like that's the subject in a sense, the thing that comes to think of itself as the subject. So I just that move, as far as that move works, I think I get that. The idea of the genic unconscious is the kind of the one that is, if anyone's in the driver's seat, if you want to call it that way, that's how I read that. It's not like the subject writ large, but the genic unconscious. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about this.
Yeah, so it helps, and this is what they clarify as they move into 329. The signifying chain of the unconscious, Newman, is not used to discover or decipher codes of desire, but to cause absolutely decoded flows of desire, libido, to circulate and to discover and desire that which scrambles all the codes and undoes all the territorialities. So really, this is obviously referring more directly to the schizophrenic or the inclusive disjunction here. But it helps me to keep in mind too, like they clarify this in the beginning, right? Newman becomes libidinal energy becomes numinous energy, which becomes voluptuous energy in the third synthesis. So there's a continuity of the flow as it's moving through these syntheses.
But that's in schizoanalysis. Their critique here seems to be talking about that, to quote directly, psychoanalysis makes a molar use of the signifying chain that results in a appreciation of all the syntheses. So the three things you're talking about, they're talking about how psychoanalysis, by recording or axiomatizing flows of desire in this way, actually is a misappreciation of all the syntheses.
Yeah, you get the paralogisms, right?
Yes. Okay.
And that's kind of what I think they're getting at. If you go back to, like, I know I brought this up a lot, that diagram, I think like 282 or whatever the end of 4.1 is, right? There's a way in which the flow of desire goes through the territorial machines and gets deterritorialized and reterritorialized, or decoded and recoded, right? And I think that's what they're talking about here, is like there's a way in which psychoanalysis, when things bounce back from the body without organs, psychoanalysis can continue the paralogisms of desire here.
Okay, I think I grasp. I think, yes, that makes more sense. All right. Any last comments before we move on to the next paragraph, which is where I actually do understand. I like these next few paragraphs. It's been up to this point that I have more trouble. I'll continue reading. The body without organs is the model of death. As the authors of horror stories have understood so well, it is not death that serves as the model for catatonia. It is catatonic schizophrenia that gives its model to death. Zero intensity. The death model appears when the body without organs repels the organs and lays them aside. No mouth, no tongue, no teeth, to the point of self-mutilation, to the point of suicide. Yet there is no real opposition between the body without organs and the organs as partial objects. The only real opposition is to the molar organism that is their common enemy. In the desiring machine, one sees the same catatonic inspired by the immobile motor that forces him to put aside his organs, to immobilize them, to silence them, but also impelled by the working parts that work in an autonomous or stereotyped fashion to reactivate the organs, to reanimate them with local movements. It is a question of different parts of the machine, different and coexisting, different in their very existence. Hence, it is absurd to speak of a death desire that would presumably be in a qualitative opposition to the life desires. Death is not desired. There is only death that desires, by virtue of the body without organs, or the immobile motor, and there is also life that desires by virtue of the working organs. There we do not have two desires, but two parts, two kinds of desiring machine parts, in the dispersion of the machine itself. And yet the problem persists. How can all that function together? For it is not yet a functioning, but solely the non-structural conditioning of a molecular functioning. The functioning appears when the motor, under the preceding conditions, i.e., without ceasing to be immobile and without forming an organism, attracts the organs to the body without organs and appropriates them for itself in the apparent objective movement. Repulsion is the condition of the machine's functioning, but attraction is the functioning itself. That the functioning depends on repulsion is clear to us, inasmuch as it all works only by breaking down. One is then able to say what this is running or this functioning consists of. In the cycle of the desiring machine, it is a matter of constantly translating, constantly converting the death model into something else altogether, which is the experience of death. Converting the death that rises from within, in the body without organs, into the death that comes from without, on the body without organs.
So here, it's another way to talk about the deterritorialization and reterritorialization, in the sense that for any assemblage that needs to move, there's a need of destructuration. You know, you need to destroy yourself from the inside to actually restructure yourself. So it's always a move between a positive force and inertia, always in going back and forth. So, for example, for anything to change, there's a need for an inherent destruction. So that this is what they're trying to say in this. And, you know, there's always the molar versus the molecular. The molar is the moment of structuration, and the molecular is the moment of movement.
Yeah, and that's the twist on it, right? Because if I remember correctly, like for Freud, the death drive is sort of contra to the libidinal drive. But here their point is that it's not like they're in opposition, right? Like if desire works by breaking down, and it's not actually some other force that's breaking down desire. Right, so it's complementary rather than contrary.
So would you say this is related to anti-production?
I think so, because they're talking about the body without organs here. Is how do they put it? The body without the body without organs. The body without organs is the model of death.
But I like the way that they talk about this, the line specifically, death is not desired. There is only death that desires. Again, going back to the idea of this sort of core libidinal flow that is the energy that sort of powers everything, that it's not death as its own sort of desire pathway, but instead death that desires and utilizes this libidinal energy for itself, which I think is an interesting take, given sort of Freud's take is very much that there is its own drive and its own power source effectively for the death drive.
Because if we want to put this on a schema, you know, we need to ask ourselves: is death at the beginning? Like, let's take an individual life, for example. Is death at the beginning, at the end, or within the process? And depending where we put death, it could be at three places at the same time, but it's always this zero force that always gives, on which, you know, the impulse need to take as a base. So to produce something, you need a negative, or like, you know, a 0 point somewhere, and you always need to like start from there.
So one of the things I have a question about is where they talk early on about catatonic schizophrenia that gives its model to death, zero intensity. So my understanding of the Freudian death drive is basically the concept of self-destructive desires, aggression, hatred, chaos, whereas their play for this feels more like almost the heat death of the universe, where there's no energy and no anything, absent of all of that. Like the death model appears when the body without organs repels the organs and lays them aside. It has no mouth, no tongue, no teeth. It has no machines. The body without organs itself is nothing. It is catatonia. It is this different sort of take on death, rather than almost this apocalyptic energy that the death drive pushed through Freud. It's
It would be more the Big Bang energy in the sense that it's undifferentiated.
And smooth, I suppose.
It sounds different from. So for Freud, in my reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the death drive, compulsion repetition, he sort of reads it to be the drive to master one's own death. And it has like paradoxical, I don't know, ways of showing itself. But this move seems closer to Lacan's reading of the death drive insofar as all drives are death drives, that there is no legitimate difference between Eros and Thanatos. But at the same time, it's different from Lacan insofar as it creates something. So for Lacan, the death drive is almost always a problem of nostalgia, of like a looking back, not a reminiscence, but nostalgia, in the sense that the object of nostalgia is the object of anxiety, which is a partial object, or would be like Freud's thing.
Yeah, and in my readings of Lacan, it was always a nostalgia of almost a safe, a beautiful past, not necessarily a good or healthy one, but this. It is about the mother's breast, but there's a harmony and safety inside of it that is waiting for you, and that's the death drive is pushing towards that. This feels like almost. It does feel a lot closer to the Lacanian sense. Freud, I've always taken it as being. It's always felt like the energy behind a death drive is destructive.
But this kind of also goes. What I see here is it goes to what we were saying last time about how, in some ways, they use psychoanalysis, and in other ways they throw it out. So, like with Lacan, I think earlier in one of these pages they talk about how he was able to see the real inorganization of desire, like beneath the surface, so-called. But that you're right, I think, Ken, that this, you could almost read this like it almost looks as though they're talking about a lack, right? But I think it almost works with what we were talking about last time, because it's as though Lacanian psychoanalysis stops at this phase. And we know that beneath this, there's still the teeming, desiring machines. Whereas what Lacanian psychoanalysis, or anyone that's based on lack, will see is that zero intensity, or is that absence, and say, well, this is the foundation on which like the subject is produced. But I like the idea. I don't know if I fully grasp the concept of zero intensity. I'm kind of understanding it like a limit, the way that they describe the body without organs itself, which I don't know if that means it's synonymous, but the idea of it as the necessary, like the built upon absence that then draws things onto it, that I'm kind of understanding.
Yeah, if I can say something to that real fast.
Please.
So the reason why it's paradoxical is because so sort of left to its own thing, I mean, the death drive does seem to end up in entropy or something, but that's not what we see happen. What we see happen is it pushes a person beyond the pleasure principle. Trying to master one's own death does, getting outside of one's own identity or body. So you end up doing something like participating in chili eating contests or something like this. And the Lacanian lack. So it's not. I mean, it's a myth. And Lacan says it's a myth. He says the lamella is a myth. So it's not. I've never understood the. I've never understood the criticism that there is no lack, because Lacan says it plainly in Seminar. What is it, 10, that there is no lack. It's like a production of lack, or it's like a virtual. It's like the idea of lack or something. And that is what the object A is.
which is at the same time the object of anxiety. And so you were talking about how, it's nostalgia to go back to the thing, Freud's thing, which is like the not mother. But what this does is it ends up like destroying the person. Yeah, the not mother.
Ken, am I correct? Thanos or the death drive is part of self-destructive behavior, right?
For Freud, it seems to look like that, but even Freud makes the point that it's not like always the case. But at the same time, he does make it sound like, it is this will to reduce oneself to, I don't know, no longer being animated or whatever.
Let's go back to what Bo, I think he offered us a little paragraph, a little citation or quote that help us explain or understand where psychoanalysis and Freud stand on the question for some of us who are not well vested. So I might read it real quick. On the basis of theoretical considerations underpinned by biology, we posited a dead drive charged with the task of causing animate organism to revert to an inanimate state, whereas Eros pursues the goal of maximizing the complexity of life and thereby, of course, preserving it by a never more catalytic combination of the particles into which living matter has been fragmented. According to this view, the emergence of life is therefore the cause both of the urge to carry on living and simultaneously of the urge for death, while its life itself is a battle and constant compromise between those two urges. Considered thus, the question as to the origin of life remains a cosmological one, while the question as to the purpose and intention of life is answered in dualistic terms.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the idea that, at least as I interpret that, right, like there's a problem of the death drive and the libidinal drive, or Eros and Thanatos, for Freud being opposed to one another. But I think what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is, no, there's a continuity where they actually are two parts of the same mechanism, and they actually work together, whether it's through repulsion or attraction. It's collaborative.
And I would agree with this. I think that's a really good point, in the sense that we move from a dualistic understanding to a more processual one. In the process, there's no duality. Everything depends on the other, and everything is intertwined into one machine. So, it's like two movement of a motor, like a piston. I don't know what's a piston in English, but, as it pushes the gas and it turns in the ignition, the pulse and the repulse are dependent on making the motor function. You cannot take the negative out of it because the motor will not function if you do it, So it's like both of those movements are constitutive of what's happening.
Yeah, to me, I don't see it as, I don't think it's absent or negative. It's like, when I see zero, I think of like an origin point, or I think of you guys remember like graphs in like high school where you got the 4 quadrants, and then in the middle there's an origin point, which is usually zero. That's what I think about with what they're saying here is the body without organs is where this stuff kind of arises out of, either through miraculation or repulsion.
Well, I'm going to push us into the next paragraph because, as Ben commented, it continues, and it's worth continuing to read. But it seems that things are becoming very obscure. For what is this distinction between the experience of death and the model of death? Here again, is it a death desire, a being for death, or rather an investment of death, even if speculative? None of the above. The experience of death is the most common of occurrences in the unconscious, precisely because it occurs in life and for life, in every passage or becoming, in every intensity as passage or becoming. It is, in the very nature of every intensity, to invest within itself the zero intensity starting from which it is produced, in one moment, as that which grows or diminishes according to an infinity of degrees. As Klosowski noted, an afflux is necessary merely to signify the absence of intensity. We have attempted to show in this respect how the relations of attraction and repulsion produced such states, sensations, and emotions, which imply a new energetic conversion and form the third kind of synthesis, the synthesis of conjunction. One might say that the unconscious as a real subject has scattered an apparent residual and nomadic subject around the entire compass of its cycle, a subject that passes by way of all the becomings, corresponding to the included disjunctions. The last part of the desiring machine, the adjacent part. These intense becomings and feelings, these intensive emotions, these intense feelings, these intense becomings and feelings, these intense emotions feed deliriums and hallucinations. But in themselves, these intensive emotions are closest to the matter, whose 0 degree they invest in itself. They control the unconscious experience of death, insofar as death is what is felt in every feeling, what never ceases and never finishes happening in every becoming. In the becoming another sex, the becoming God, the becoming a race, etc., forming zones of intensity on the body without organs. Every intensity controls within its own life the experience of death and envelops it, and it is doubtless the case that every intensity is extinguished at the end, that every becoming itself becomes a becoming death. Death, then, does actually happen. Maurice Blanchot distinguishes this twofold nature clearly. These two irreducible aspects of death. The one, according to which the apparent subject never ceases to live and travel as a one never stops and never has done with dying. And the other, according to which this same subject, fixed as I, actually dies, which is to say it finally ceases to die since it ends up dying, in the reality of a last instant that fixes it in this way as in all the while undoing the intensity, carrying it back to the 0 that envelops it.
When he refers to Blanchot, just a little precision in language. When he say one in English, in French it's on. It's a non-specific subject. It's a general. It's like it's not one as a unity. It's more like closer to it, but it as a subjectified thing.
Oh,
A thing, yeah.
One can be used like that in English. It's more of a classic English. Well, one must never wear such a shirt. Things like that.
Okay, gotcha. I just wanted to specify because it marks a certain type of unity which is not there.
Yeah, no, it's intended to be non-specific. So I'm going to ask. I have so many questions. Does anyone want to take a crack at this paragraph before I dive in? Because this is a lot of words, and I'm having difficulty understanding, honestly, how death is a thing that is enveloped in the thing and then also becomes the thing when the thing decides to stop ceasing the thing, which just feels like complex language word games almost.
Yeah, I'll try and kick it off, and Ken, maybe you can help me out with my psychoanalytic reference point. But so, like, if we step back, right, and we remember, like, again, we're developing, like, so we're talking about the unconscious here. Part of their move that they're making throughout this book, and I think they're reaffirming here, right? So we've talked about how, like, the id and the ego and the superego have kind of fallen away during this theory of the unconscious. And in large part, that's because since we're dealing with partial objects, since we're dealing with desiring machines, this ontology, it becomes a lot harder to center everything in the person or the subject, more specifically, right? So, like, typically in psychoanalysis, like, with the death drive that we were just talking about, with, like, the chili eating contest, or whatever, right? Like, that becomes a way of, just like Ken was saying, talking about neuroticism, talking about anxiety, or talking about the psychotic, right? Like, if you talk about in terms of desire, it's a problem of, like, how the ego is regulating the id's desires and where the superego is and all that. So what we're seeing here is they're moving So they're moving out of this, but they're not moving out of it by trying to say like, no, there's not a death drive. They're not trying to get anything. Their move here is to affirm that death is part of desiring and that there is a becoming of death.
Yeah, and maybe one thing. Here again, is it a dead desire or a being for that? This is for me. It's something that answers to Heidegger into its form of ontology, and they say something like the experience of death is the most common of occurrences in the unconscious, but at the same time, somebody like Heidegger would say that you cannot experience that. Death, it's like a moment of non-being. So, and I think there's like a little reference, a little poke there to this form of understanding of life and death, and they're placing death within life and something that preys upon life constantly, and not something that is at the end or elsewhere.
Well, and something we do, right?
Something that actually preconditions the individual drives.
They do talk about on one of the next pages, I think 332, about the two camps, the ones that say that you can't, the ones that both say that there must be a death instinct, and the ones that say that there can't be one because there's no model or experience. But then they're saying, well, we believe there is a model and an experience of it in the unconscious. I wonder if, just in my head as I'm trying to understand this, going back to that ship of Theseus thing we were talking about yesterday, Brooks, I wonder if that's kind of where the end of the paragraph is coming from, in that idea of the ship of Theseus constantly having to, break apart and be reconstructed, and every single board is being replaced. Like if you're thinking about any kind of, or I don't want to say organism, that's not the word they would use, but any kind of existence does that.
Chain. I mean, that's how they talk about the chain. I mean, just in the last few paragraphs, ultimately as well.
Right. Well, so I mean, maybe that in that sense, like the death in the sense of what we've always been talking about, the desiring machines break down in order to function. To think of that breaking down as simply an external force that is opposed to the life of the thing is to kind of already get stuck in all these like later representational games or like anthropocentric ways of thinking about things.
Okay, well, I'm gonna ask because, Ken, I know you're more versed in Lacan than I am. My understanding of Lacanian death drive is not that it was its own separate thing, but really, he spent his later lectures, if memory serves, actually basically saying all drives have some level of death drive in them.
Yeah, he says all drives are death drives.
So is that this feels like if we're talking about Freud comes along and says, no, humans have a death drive. And Lacan comes along and goes, well, actually, it's not a specific death drive. All drives have death drives. And then Guattari and Deleuze come along and they go, oh, yeah, well, that's very true. But it's actually that
all death have drives.
all it's not so much that everything has a death drive. It's that death is a part of every drive and is a pulling force as well. And that's the part, that last thing is the part I'm trying to understand. What are they trying to say that's in, because what you guys just said sounds like what Lacan said, which is that every drive has death in it.
I don't think it's the same though, because that's why I tried to use the example, whether it's right or not, from yesterday, because in my mind, it goes back to the D&G thing of it's always productive. It's not, it's not desiring destruction. It's not unconscious thinking something and wanting to be a particular way. And so it strives towards the something. It's literally like how it's another side of how the productive process itself happens. So that's why I feel it's a slight difference. But
But we can also see this as it's like a topological kind of understanding, as every intensity, let's put it into number. Every intensity of 100 also encompasses the intensity of 0, because, it's a reference point of where it stands as an intensity. So every life, as is death or 0 level intensity, encompassed into it. So there's always this, and the example of the motor is this: to produce 100 units of energy, it's always in reference to its 0 unit of production. I don't know if that makes sense or help anything.
Well, it does, and so Again, to go back to what everyone views death as, because and Ken, please help me here. Freud, when he used the term death, is not the same thing as what we're talking about now.
No, it doesn't sound like it. And so Freud, it seems like Freud stole all this from, not stole, I shouldn't say that, but he
was deeply inspired.
Yeah, he was deeply inspired by Sabina Spielrein's destruction as a cause of coming into being, which it seems much closer to what, further away from what Lacan was talking about, and then closer to what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about. But I think one of the major differences is that the object that the death drive repeats on, that it starts circling around, is the thing, is the object Pt2, right? And that keeps one in the whole daddy, mommy, me phallus thing, even if it's beyond, even if the object Pt2 and like jouissance is beyond the big other or whatever. It's the lack in the symbolic order. It's where the symbolic order hiccups. It still maintains that daddy, mommy, me thing. It still maintains that what you're doing and circling around is going back to some, is the recapitulation of the fantasy that you can go back to some primary narcissism where you're in the oneness of like no longer having a differentiation between subject and object, where you're a baby in the womb or something. Whereas it seems like Deleuze and Guattari say that that's not what this all leads back to. This can produce something new, which was Sabina Spielrein's point. That destruction can be the cause for a becoming.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, because and that's what a lot of their ontology does, and makes much more difficult, is the idea that you can just take like the chili eating contest and look at that and say, oh well, he's just suffering from narcissism, or like anorexia, or it's a problem of wish fulfillment, right? To be really like stereotypically psychoanalytical. But conversely, like, and it's not simply destruction, is it? Like, it's anti-production, which is kind of nice here, because since anti-production is produced, right, the vital organs is produced and inserted, there's a way in which, like, it's not simply like, we can use the word destruction. That's not the, I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but it's also in like dying here, right? Like, it's affirmative in that sense, where it's not simply like, it's not like a problem of like what comes after life anymore, or like the end of life. They're talking about like I think about when I play a record and like, it ends and the needle pulls off, right? Like there's a certain anti-production there.
I was just saying in the chat as well, I think we need to think kind of like Roger's always saying, like ecologically and topographically. Like, if you think about in ecologies and in nature and the earth, and even in our own bodies, like even in the other examples we've used, cells and skin and all the rest of it, like fertilizer, the earth's humus, like the surfaces, like all these things, it only from an anthropocentric kind of like perspective will we see death as an end or beginning of something, rather than as part of the like actual like possibility of life, which we know intrinsically in like agriculture,
Yeah, because that's the difference between life and a life also. And, I think you're touching to something that is important.
And this might be a good place to go into the Blanchot reference.
Okay, I'm going to ask because I'm trying to follow along and I don't know why I'm having so much trouble. So here what we're talking about is their version of death, as they're talking about, is ultimately anti-production.
Yeah, I think so, because they're not talking about the death drive in like the typical sense. They're talking about in terms of anti-production, like the record moving between grooves, right? There's a way in which, and I'm just using that as an example, but there's a way in which like the procedurality, like there's things happening where the needle is being moved, right? And there's things ending, and there's it's not like so like when the reason I like the Blonde Show thing is he talks about dying, right? Like dying is part of the process. When you play a note on a guitar, it does end. Or otherwise, like when you apply tremolo, like that is an application of staggering the note.
Okay. So this is sounding different than my understanding of what anti-production was, which up till this point, I saw anti-production as, as he says, the body without organs is basically this almost pure anti-production. That's what it exists as. The body without organs is anti-production, which means that by being that, it's basically positioned in a place almost opposing subjectivity.
No, it's
I don't think of it.
it's the end of subjectivity or the complete actualization, and then subjectivity, the possibilities of subjectivity stop at the moment anti-production comes in.
Right.
So, and then production would be putting that subjectivity back in movement, allowing becomings. So that's the topological, movements of like being full and being empty and being just because between when you're full, you're at the same place as when you're empty, because it's a zero sum or like 100% sum. So, and then the in between allows to go up or down in intensity. So this movement, the anti-production will be like 100% all the time.
But I would say it's not that the body without organs is anti-production, because they talk about anti-production as a flow itself. And the body without organs is the result of anti-production and itself. Like that's why they always come back to, and for me at least, I always think of that term surface, because it's a surface that is created as a result of these processes, that it by necessity, in order to have any kind of solidity, it has to repel things. So it becomes the kind of limit point. They say in the previous section, it's both the limit, it's both produced as like another part, and also it becomes the limit of the kind of like field of presence. Is that the phrase they use?
Well, it's
So,
the first section of this book. They have the sentence that says the full body without organs belongs to the realm of anti-production.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But I was just thinking of it. It's not that it is anti-production itself. It's that it functions according to the logic of anti-production. But then as we're reading, it also magnetizes and attracts as well. So it can't just be that.
And what anti-production is a moment in it, and it's like a counteracting force that allows for other becomings, because it stops a certain type of becoming by filling it and allows for another.
Okay.
So, and if we look at the surface as the body without organ as a surface, production and anti-productions are two moments of it. And a body without organ can stabilize, but its stabilization gives way to possible other lines of flight. I'm going too far into the conceptual thing, but the moment, for example, a city, when a city is perfectly built, something will break. And this breakage from the anti-productive moment that allows another production or another form of becoming within the city.
Yeah, I don't think you're going too far, because that's actually really critical for the second and third syntheses, right? Because the body without organs being part of the distribution, and the third part, which is consumption, or like if we want to talk about subjectivity, it like you're saying, right, like in terms of lines and flight of that, but that is very much bound up in what the body without organs, how it's going to be recorded upon, how it's going to distribute, how that second synthesis is operating, right, with the either or the double bind, and likewise into the third synthesis, which they only briefly touch on here, but right, like in terms of like where there's going to be subjectivity, right, like that is part of what comes from that process with the body without organs.
So it's essentially the absence of process. So we're talking about the process happens, and then death is ultimately that absence of process, which allows breaks and allows new becomings to exist.
Yeah, would make sense. And if we can take the example of the vinyl, there's a difference between the vinyl and the tape. The vinyl is a completed object. There's no becoming to a vinyl. It can break down. There's going to be changes into the way it plays, into if we leave it into the sun. But as a good that is being produced, it has no becoming. But a tape, you can put the little tape on the top of the little hole at the top and re-record on it. So there's a possibility of becoming to the tape, which was not possible into the vinyl.
So there is a possibility, right? As you play the record, you're actually like slowly damaging it, right? So it is actually breaking down, and you see this with the pops and the cracks and the static. For instance, my grandfather, the joke about his records was they all sounded like firecrackers, which they absolutely did. It was like listening to firecrackers over Sinatra. But it's the same principle as you're saying.
I was just going to say before we moved on to that, maybe something to keep in mind, at least from where I'm sitting, that I don't think of the BWO as opposed to subjectivity either. I don't know if that's the right way of going about it, because to me, I see it as the possibility for, it creates the possibility for experience, and that can go in various directions and be reappropriated and maybe liberated, but it's not in the process. It functions as an absence, like you said, an endpoint or an anti-productive moment, but it also is, like we're saying, it's the surface upon which things are recorded. So it's not like opposed to subjectivity, like molar, reified, Oedipalized subjects. They don't not have a BWO or something. That literally creates the possibility of that.
Yeah, subjectivity is the process of consuming the intensities that are recorded on the body without organs, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I wish they got into that third synthesis more here, but that's really critical because it doesn't take subjectivity off the table, but it like you're saying, right? Like there's a way in which the body without organs is part of like the miraculating, the repulsion, but also the distribution and the consumption of the intensities. I wanted to say too, though, I wasn't sure. Like, is the body without organs? When you say like the absence of a process, could you elaborate on that?
Me? I was just using the language that Brooks was using. I don't know if I thought of it.
No, it was directed to Mr. Brooks.
So, and again, this is how I'm kind of trying to parse what this means by placing it into what I think is the rest of Deleuze's work. The concept of repetition, especially if we're following, and again, Ken, please feel free to jump in here. We're following the Lacanian idea of the death instinct. The way Lacan has the death instinct appear is that ultimately becomes this world of repetition. When you repeat things, you have a compulsion to do those things due to the death instinct coming across. The death instinct happens when a thing ends and you feel the absence of it and that lack, and then you go do it again and again and again and again and again, compulsively. This feels very similar to that in the sense that our ability to become becoming exists thanks to the repetition of these processes. And if we have the process happen through the three syntheses, at some point the flow has to, because it has death built into it, as they talk about, or the heat death, the absence of life, whatever they want to call it. It feels like it's pushing towards the idea that you have the process happening. At some point, the process doesn't happen. That is the death of the process. And they feel the cycle. The next paragraph, I was reading ahead. The next paragraph seems to push towards that. I'm going to read, and then let's continue this. To continue reading. From one aspect to the other, there is not at all a personal deepening, but something quite different. There is a return from the experience of death to the model of death in the cycle of the desiring machines. The cycle is closed. For a new departure, since this is another, the experience of death must have given us exactly enough broadened experience in order to live and know that the desiring machines do not die, and that the subject, as an adjacent part, is always a one who conducts the experience, not a who receives the model.
Not an I.
Not an I who receives the model, for the model itself is not the I either, but the body without organs. And I does not rejoin the model without the model starting out again in the direction of another experience. Always going from the model to the experience and starting out again, returning from the model to the experience, is what schizophrenizing death amounts to, the exercise of the desiring machines, which is their very secret, well understood by the terrifying authors. The machines tell us this, make us live it, feel it, deeper than delirium and further than hallucination. Yes, the return to repulsion will condition other attractions, other functionings, the setting in motion of other working parts on the body without organs, the putting to work of other adjacent parts on the periphery that have as much a right to say one as we ourselves do. Let him die in his leaping through the unheard of and unnameable things. Other horrible workers will come. They will begin on the horizons where the other collapsed. The eternal return as experience and as deterritorialized circuit of all the cycles of desire. Now, if you're not, I fucked up some of that reading because the PDF I have did some really terrible text recognition. So apologize.
And in this, if we want to take this and that the subject as an adjacent part, it's adjacent, it's secondary, it's something outside or something, on the periphery, is always a one, on, who conducts the experience, not an I who receives the model. So, for example, it's not Brooks that is receiving the model through the experience, it's Brooks that is being on the periphery of the process. So Brooke, into a Simondon sense, is metastable in the sense that it's always reconstructed and produced by the processes that happen from the body without organ through experience.
So to Jack's question about how I see, when they talk about the cycle of the desiring machines and the repetition there, that ultimately can yield becoming, it feels as though this is the cycle they're talking about.
So it's always a cycle of intensity, from zero to something that actualizes itself, from potentiality, from the virtual to the actual, from potentiality to the materialization of the energy, how the energy passes through and creates something. But it's always like a back and forth kind of thing. It's like walking, Walking is always, and I don't remember the author who says this, but like walking is like always falling down. So by you propulsing yourself up front with your energy, and then you fall down. And then the moment you fall down and restabilize yourself, you're able to repropulse yourself. So it's a cycle of energy always coming in and out, and allows for becoming, transition, transposition, or whatever kind of movement we want to imagine.
Yeah, part of how I'm thinking about it is like to that point about like stepping, right? With the step, there's all sorts of like dying becomings there, right? Like there's a way in which to take a step, right? Like you leave the ground, you're moving through, your foot is moving through the air and all that. There's a way in which like all of this is part of like is part of the end of where you began in a sense, but it's also moving toward the end of the becoming, right? And then comes the next step. Without the body, without organs, as far as I can tell, like you'd pretty much have like the foot and the other desiring machines that are forming the assemblage. It seems to me like they wouldn't really be able to start or stop. They'd just be trying to basically connect, and there wouldn't be a way for like a distribution or a functionality to effectively take place through the potentiality being actualized.
So when it talks about the model and the experience as being kind of going from model to experience, the model is effectively the BWO.
Yes, which is found into the pre-individual.
Right. And the actual experience is actually where the subjectivity is created the moment that the individual goes through the experience, which generally speaking is not going to be exactly like the model because that's not how things work out.
Because that's repetition. Repetition is because it's something that we've probably discussed prior. I've missed a few sessions, but repetition is not a copy paste. Repetition is a slight variation into the reproduction.
Yep.
It's so. The experience is this variation. It's this possible differentiation. How do you say this in English again? Differentiation. So differentiation happens from like the the image to the simulacrum. The simulacrum is this kind of shifting, and experience allows for this shifting. And experience is just not the human experience; it's the experience of the rock in the desert that is being exposed to wind, exposed to erosion, exposed to the sun. So it transforms. It has an experience of. It experiences the forces that goes on it and through it.
It's Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche's Eternal Return.
Yeah, and that's important because, at least as I'm understanding it, right, during that third synthesis, they give the example of like the ego going round and round. So, right, like obviously it's not the ego as we think about it, but that's kind of how they're making the point. So, like with the desiring machines and all that, the way subjectivity is happening there is, it's, as far as I can tell, is like with the assemblage, there's like a collective, and this comes, I think, from the distribution of the intensities. There's a way in which all of that is during the consummative and consumptive process is actually experiencing it more directly, and that comes with ending the process too.
Well, and the paragraph I just read ends with the sentence, the eternal return as experience and as deterritorialized circuit of all the cycles of desire. I was more making the statement as I was reading that I was like, oh shit, this is Nietzsche. Like, there's a reason he capitalizes eternal return. I feel so stupid suddenly.
I guess we gotta look at footnote 29.
So one of the things that came to mind for me when we read this paragraph, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Was about the model and experience. I kind of had this visual of the experiment, the experimenter who works with models, and that the models, start taking on this kind of life of their own. So in many ways, he's kind of tracing out a kind of empirical subjectivity in the sense that the subject, as scientist, can step away and appreciate the models as desiring machines of their own. And so now his subjectivity is, or hers subjectivity is in balance, or is kind of curious and awake to the desiring machines, which are the models that they're working with. So that helped me understand this paragraph a little bit. And then, so to tie that into the eternal return is that so every cadence of anti-production by the subject can still be observed, or at least there is a knowing that the desiring machines will be moving on with whatever it is that they virtually inherit, or the intensity that they gain through the when the subject stops. So the desiring machines continue on, and somehow I was able to see that as the virtual intensities are part of the eternal returns, that they get recirculated, either in the models or in the experiment that the models are part of. I don't know. I might have dissipated into some vagary there at the end, but there is a way for the subject to now find himself in relation to the desiring machines that are also giving him back information around his subjectivity as they continue on. So there is that symbiotic, or that relationship between them. I'm not sure if that's a great translation of that paragraph, but that was what's coming to mind for me.
So, Sorry, my brain's trying to shift gears. So for me, I'm hesitant to say that, and maybe this is a whole other thing. Subjectivity is, to me, at this point, my understanding is a virtual surface that exists sort of as a layer produced by the general machines or the desiring machines of the unconscious, and the subjectivity is created around that. Anti-production helps shape subjectivity in that process, and there's a lot of things that sort of created. Again, it's a virtual surface that exists. The thing that, for me, that makes it really tough to understand, Alyosha puts it best. The body without organs is the surface, subjectivity is the part that's put into motion by it. It's a virtual affect of all of these things coming together. Am I wrong on that, Alyosha? Is there another take on that?
I'm still thinking of it myself, but I think going back to what Roger said about metastable is a good way of just looking at it, like what you are and what you experience of you. Like if you imagine it, you're a mapping a metastable system, and there's like 14 different elements, and you are this little red dot on the side, and there's still the 13 other like elements of what that metastable system is. Like from the perspective of you, the red dot, you're saying, I am this thing, I am the whole system, but you're not. That's why it's an adjacent part.
Mm-hmm. And when we put this into a real, methodology and analysis, and put all of this in praxis, is to see, for example, I think it's Latour who actually gives that example. I'll stop giving my own examples, but he's talking about the seaman who's on his boat, and the boat is rocking. So by being there, is understanding of the world, but also his body is changing in regard to the movements of the sea and the rocking back and forth of the boat. So his legs will develop in such a way that it offers more stability. So as a subject of this process, he's always at the receiving end, and he's receiving those forces, those flux, and it transforms him as matter. But also by transforming him as matter, this matter allows him to do way more stuff onto the boat and adapt to the boat. So this back and forth of becoming, stabilization becomes a new identity, and the new identity is deterritorialized again, starts moving, enters back into the process, transform, and adapts. So the model of adaptation works like that also.
Yeah, and that's really critical. Like we talked yesterday a little bit about like the active syntheses. Right. Part of the big move they're making here is these are passive syntheses. So it's not like in your example of the seaman, it's not like the seaman is producing this by his intent and he's got this kind of power over it all. He's being produced within it.
Yes, exactly. And it's the same as, what was really striking into my own work is working with people with visual impairment, and how, they're going around the street and they receive all this information and they start doing cognitive mapping. It's blind mapping, and they understand where they are on the street according to different stimulus that they're getting. But this is all a learned process, and it's not because they are receiving all this information as a computer would receive the information, but as they become into their experience. So one blind person was telling me, it was really interesting because that person would describe the environment maybe like 60 feet in advance, where people using wheelchair would detail the environment as they would meet it. So the person with blindness would preemptively recreate the environment in their mind to actually get in contact with it and use it, and be able to correspond correctly to the elements of the environment. So that's an interesting thing, because this person is not just receiving this information, but it's always an ongoing process of becoming within an environment, learning, shifting, attuning senses, and all of that.
And if I understand correctly too, to that point, like, so like your point about like the activation of memory there, like if I'm understanding these syntheses correctly, like that is enabled in part with the body without organs, through the body without organs and the recording process, which is kind of like memory, but not exactly. But right with that, there's a familiarity with the distribution. So when that person is walking and the assemblage is happening and changing and becoming, right, we're seeing the libidinal flow is happening. If I understand correctly, right, there's a way in which that assemblage, like, sort of like the body without organs starts to recognize this, or at least can produce the recognition.
And that's what they say. It's a recording device. And, that's what it is. It's like learning to play an instrument, learning to bike, learning, there's inscription, there's recording there.
Exactly. And so then what happens with that recording is that gets sort of like accessed, right? And that distribution follows from there. So we talked about the functionality yesterday, right? So like this is where like in terms of walking, like the foot start to like the assemblage is changing in reference to that, and the distribution of like the foot's taking the steps, and like how the person is experiencing that that's sort of like what we're calling memory here. That all comes together so that that the functionality can be distributed in that manner.
Mm-hmm. So I think what we need to I think we can start moving on to the next one.
Well, I'd love to, but I have so I'm taking a lot of this in, and thank you for the metaphor. Actually helps a lot. But one of the things they talk about early on, a few paragraphs ago, is the death model appears when the body without organs repels the organs and lays them aside. This seems to be a very specific call towards the capital socius versus the despot versus the prehistory versus the savage, whatever you want to call it, where the BWO is not laying aside the mouth, the tongue, the teeth. It would imply heavily that the last few paragraphs talk about essentially that under capital, death is omnipresent and never leaves us, is part of everything we do.
Yeah, that's fine. I give the kind of example of like when the assemblage is changing, right? That seems to me to, right, with the body without organs being produced in that moment of change, that is also like that is that being kind of falling away and giving way to like a becoming, like Roger's saying. Okay.
This is something I want to. I'm making notes of this. We're going to spend some time in the review talking about this for sure, because it's a lot. Let me jump to the next paragraph so we can eventually get through at least 2 or 3 pages. How odd the psychoanalytic venture is. Psychoanalysis ought to be a song of life, or else be worth nothing at all. It ought, practically, to teach us to sing life, and see how the most defeated, sad song of death emanates from it. Eopopeia. That's a wonderful sounding word. I probably didn't say it right, but I like how I pronounced it. From the start, and because of his stubborn dualism of the drives, Freud never stopped trying to limit the discovery of a subjective or vital essence of desire as libido. But when the dualism passed into a death instinct against eros, there was no longer a simple limitation. It was a liquidation of the libido. Reich did not go wrong here, and was perhaps the only one to maintain that the product of analysis should be a free and joyous person, a carrier of the life flows, capable of carrying them all the way into the desert and decoding them, even if this idea necessarily took on the appearance of a crazy idea given what had become of analysis. He demonstrated that Freud, no less than Jung and Adler, had repudiated the sexual position. The fixing of the death instinct, in fact, deprives sexuality of its generative role on at least one machinic element of desire, the desiring machines. It is a matter of eliminating the libido, insofar as it implies the possibility of energetic conversions in the machine, libido numen voluptas. It is a matter of imposing the idea of an energetic duality, rendering the machinic transformations impossible, with everything obliged to pass by way of an indifferent neutral energy. That energy emanating from Oedipus and capable of being added to either of the 2 irreducible forms, neutralizing, mortifying life. The purpose of the topological and dynamic dualities is to thrust aside the point of view of functional multiplicity that alone is economic. Zondi situates the problem clearly. Why two kinds of drives, qualified as molar, functioning mysteriously, which is to say Oedipally, rather than N genes of drives, 8 molecular genes, for example, functioning machinically? I don't understand anything in this fucking paragraph at all.
Did you skip something?
Yeah,
Did I skip?
that's not how mine goes.
I think you skipped from one page to another.
Oh, no shit. Oh god, I skipped 2 pages, didn't I?
I was like, okay, I think I'm going crazy.
No, it's
I'm glad I'm
me.
not alone. Man.
Connected too much.
I hit the mouse wrong. God damn it. Sorry, everyone. I am useless. I'll back
Let's
up a
make
little bit.
Point that yeah, and just delete that from the recording.
Yes. So I'm going to reread this, and we're going to try again. How odd the psychoanalytic venture is. Psychoanalysis ought to be a song of life, or else be worth nothing at all. It ought, practically, to teach us to sing life, and see how the most defeated, sad song of death emanates from it. Eopopeia. From the start, and because of his stubborn dualism of the drives, Freud never stopped trying to limit the discovery of a subjective or vital essence of desire as libido. But when the dualism passed into a death instinct against eros, this was no longer a simple limitation. It was a liquidation of the libido. Reich did not go wrong here, and was perhaps the only one to maintain that the product of analysis should be a free and joyous person, a carrier of the life flows, capable of carrying them all the way into the desert and decoding them, even if this idea necessarily took on the appearance of a crazy idea, given what had become of analysis. He demonstrated that Freud, no less than Jung and Adler, had repudiated the sexual position. The fixing of the death instinct, in fact, deprives sexuality of its generative role on at least one essential point, which is the genesis of anxiety, since this genesis becomes the autonomous cause of sexual repression instead of its result. It follows that sexuality as desire no longer animates a social critique of civilization, but that civilization, on the contrary, finds itself sanctified as the sole agency capable of opposing the death desire. And how does it do this? By, in principle, turning death against death. By making this turned back death, la mort retournée, into a force of desire. By putting it in the service of a pseudo-life through an entire culture of guilt feeling. I believe that time I actually read the correct page. So,
Yes, you did.
So you all are welcome.
Thank you so much for being so efficient.
One thing I do want to say, because there's a lot of discussion around sort of Deleuze and whether or not he was ultimately, I guess, happy or sad or angry at the world or maybe dark. I like this phrasing. Psychoanalysis ought practically to teach us to sing life. I really like as a scene, as a line. Feels affirming.
But I'm not a Freudian, and I'm not really fond of psychoanalysis. So, like, how is it supposed to be a song of life? How is it supposed to be life affirming? Just because it like reinscribed the people into the familiar and then try to like fix them? Is that what they're trying to say?
So you got to remember, right? Like schizoanalysis is trying to de-Oedipalize psychoanalysis and bring it to its own critique. So if that project succeeds, right, if psychoanalysis allows the Oedipal thing to fall away, the familialism to fall away, if they can bring it to the auto critique and be part of like transforming it, that's when psychoanalysis can become capable of that, singing a song of life.
And I believe Eopopeia, I think, means lullaby. If I'm translating it correctly from the context I'm reading it in. It feels like a lullaby, a song to calm and help people fall asleep, child fall asleep.
Yeah, ritournelle in French. Okay, so they're not talking about psychoanalysis in the Freudian sense, but like what the discipline in itself should be doing, right?
It does feel that way, yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's sort of like saying, right, they see what psychoanalysis could be,
Well, and that's the line they have here. Reich did not go wrong and was perhaps the only one to maintain that the product of analysis should be a free and joyous person, a carrier of life flows, capable of carrying them all the way into the desert and decoding them. And then their joke is, this is an absurd idea given the direction analysis went. We should be going this way. It's intended to free people and make them joyous and beautiful. And like our job is to sing lullabies and make people happy and smile, which I like as a concept, and I think flows very nicely.
The only correction I'd make is that they use the lullaby example when they're talking about what psychoanalysis shouldn't do. So they say we see the most defeated, sad song of death that emanates from it. So I think they're using that because it's like the lullaby puts you to sleep, whereas the song of life is going to be like a friggin' Nietzschean, like, Wagnerian, like will to power kind of thing,
No, but that's exactly it. It's Nietzschean affirmation of life, right? Like where he taught in Zarathustra about dancing, right? If you have not danced today, you've like wasted your life, or I shouldn't say wasted your life, but like there's that whole thing where Zarathustra talks about dancing and turning yourself up on your head, being able to laugh and laugh at yourself, right? Like you can't do that in psychoanalysis when you're constantly like, there's this constant problem of repression. There's that constant problem of like where they say like desire sees itself and becomes stymied, right, because of this guilt.
I actually, Alyosha, I read that sentence completely different from you, where they say, and see how the most defeated, sad song of death emanates from it. It's, to me, that's a life-affirming thing, that even the most sad song of death ultimately emanates from this beautiful life. I read it as like a positive, that and then they shit on that because they say, look, there's the dualism of the drives, this libido on the one side and death on the other, fucking or death, fucking or chaos. The dualism, Freud never stopped trying to limit the discovery of a subjective or vital essence of desire as libido, but when the dualism passed into death instinct against eros, this was no longer simple limitation, it was the liquidation of the libido. They basically, it was, they're making fun of the idea that they're these two separate drives, when in reality we have our passions, our desire, the libido, as Deleuze has talked about it, this positive force of desire that everything comes from, and death is something that's a part of that, but it's actually, again, as we've talked about, part of that becoming, part of that repetition, in the sort of Nietzschean sense of the eternal return.
Roger, maybe you can clear us up with the translation, but I'm seeing that, what do you think they're referring to when they say it? Sad song of death emanates from it, because if I think you're saying it's life, I think it means psychoanalysis. And the reason I think that is because this sentence, these two sentences, they say it should teach us to sing life, but then the next two sentences pivot to talk about, well, look, this is what it does, and this is what Freud did.
Yeah, which are they referring to? It's a grammatical question. Now that I'm rereading it, Alyosha, I think you're right. What they're saying is, look, psychoanalysts need to look at psychoanalysis, and actually it should be practically to teach us to sing life. It should be affirming in this thing we're causing people. And you ought to see that instead we've replaced this beautiful exaltation with instead Iopopeia, this awful, sad, terrible death song.
That's what I mean, because
I think you're right. I think you're right. God damn it, you're right.
We've been learning a positive, productive angle on the death instinct, but I think here unless I'm wrong here, Roger, like
what was the question again?
What's that?
What was the it that you were asking for?
That's what we're asking, is what is the it?
It says,
oh yeah, but which one?
It says, and see how the most defeated, sad song of death emanates from it, Iopopeia. I think that where the confusion was coming from is that I was seeing that as they were talking about psychoanalysis, whereas before Brooks was saying that maybe that's actually about life, and so it's a positive thing.
Oh no! The way it is, because l'aventure de la psychanalyse, it's like the venture. The it is the venture.
Not sure I follow.
Yeah, what?
Okay, it into that paragraph refers to the venture.
What's
the psychoanalytic venture? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Awkward writing.
Yeah, so in this case, they're using it almost in a colloquial sense. here of like not the death that's productive, but like the sad. I hate using these words, but like the way that they talk about like catatonic autistic forms of life that psychoanalysis develops that makes these things like neutered and milquetoast.
They liquidated the libido. The fixing of the death instinct that in fact deprives sexuality of its generative role on at least one essential point, which is the genesis of anxiety, since the genesis becomes the autonomous cause of sexual repression instead of its result. It follows that sexuality as a desire no longer animates a social critique of civilization, but that civilization, on the contrary, finds itself sanctified as the sole agency capable of opposing the death desire. Yeah, okay. I'm going to go with Alyosha's reading, and I'm just going to delete everything I said from this recording because I don't want any of this in the record books. I got it completely backwards. Fucking damn it.
Anti-production.
Do you think in there there's like it sounds like, especially that last part you just read, like a critique of civilization and its discontents? Like, kind of specifically, like when Freud's talking about how, like, you know, we have to give up this aggressive instinct, and so, like, then, like, civilization is always has this kind of, like, lack in it.
Yeah, so I can't really give more of an answer, but the hunch that this is referring to civilization and its discontent is probably right, because like I looked up Aya Popeye, and there is a Freud quote where he uses that word, although I haven't really found the context of it. He talks about a quarrel of giants that the how would you say that, Kinderfrauen, like women who care for the kids, want to sorry, I can't translate that on the fly. Without context, it's basically useless, but the Ayapopaya thing seems to be connected to civilization and its discontents. That's all I wanted to say.
I think that's what it's trying to say. So yes. I don't have anything to add to it. That's what it sounded like. Because it ends with, in principle, turning death against death, by making this turned back death into a force of desire, ultimately through an entire culture of guilt. And that is, that's again this thing that happens pre-subject with the Oedipal placement of everything. It's this pre-guilt that exists inside of you. At least that's how I'm reading it, I think.
It is interesting too to think. I've been trying to wrap my head around these middle sentences here, and I think you're like that. What you were saying, Brooks, about the liquidation of the libido. Like, I'm just in my head, I'm trying to walk it out of. So by opposing, whereas initially that there's this abstract subjective essence that Freud might have helped to discover with the whole psychoanalytic movement, he's always stuck in these dualisms, and then he takes it even further by opposing desire to this destructive element instead. So essentially you're affording, what am I saying? You're putting desire into this, you're almost like predetermining or condemning it to always be this like thing that appears later as an anomaly or as an afterthought, that as a perversion. So within this bit, what you quoted of it deprives sexuality of its generative role, which is the genesis of anxiety, since the genesis becomes autonomous. So like, yeah, it starts to almost look as though sexual repression is something that's happening sort of like secondarily. I'm not sure. I don't have enough of the language here, but I'm just trying to piece it together in my mind, if that makes sense.
So from Deleuze and Guattari's perspective, there isn't this separation of two drives or this dualism that Freud is positing. So their critique here is that because of the Freudian position here, like it is exactly what they say, right? Like you've liquidated the libido from itself and then created this duality there. From their perspective, because there isn't this segregation, what's happening is like sexuality, or more directly, the libidinal flows, desire, and production, right? Like sexuality, in the sense they're talking about it, is being stymied by the death instinct instead of like affirmed. because for them it's not this clear separation where there's like, oh yeah, there's Eros and then Thanatos, and they butt heads, right? Because they're actually collaborative and part of the same flow and two parts of the same machine, as they say. It's a collaborative venture. It's affirmative in that way. So for them, like the death drive is not, it's not opposed to libido here. It works with it, and it's not because they're understanding it so differently than Freud. It's not a central problem for them.
And again, when we talk about Freud, we're talking about Oedipalization. Like that's the thing we keep going back to. And we're about to keep going in, but it's worth us jumping to the next paragraph because the next paragraph is literally about Thanatos, Eros, and Reich even further. And so I would just like to keep going. There is no need to tell all over how psychoanalysis culminates in a theory of culture that takes up again the age-old task of the ascetic ideal, nirvana, the cultural extract, judging life, belittling life, measuring life against death, and only retaining from life what the death of death wants very much to leave us with. A sublime resignation. As Reich says, when psychoanalysis began to speak of Eros, the whole world breathed a sigh of relief. One knew what this meant, and that everything was going to unfold within a mortified life, since Thanatos was now the partner of Eros, for worse, but also for better. Psychoanalysis becomes the training ground of a new kind of priest, the director of bad conscience. Bad conscience has made us sick, and that is what will cure us. Freud did not hide what was really at issue with the introduction of the death instinct. It is not a question of any fact whatsoever, but merely of a principle, a question of principle. The death instinct is pure silence, pure transcendence, not givable and not given in experience. This very point is remarkable. It is because death, according to Freud, has neither a model nor an experience, that he makes of it a transcendent principle. So that the psychoanalysts who refused the death instinct did so for the same reasons as those who accepted it. Some said there was no death instinct since there was no model or experience in the unconscious. Others, that there was a death instinct precisely because there was no model or experience. We say to the contrary, that there is no death instinct because there is both the model and the experience of a death in the unconscious. Death, then, is a part of the desiring machine, a part that must itself be judged, evaluated in the functioning of a machine and the system of its energetic conversions, and not as an abstract principle.
Okay, that's pretty awesome. I was thinking about this earlier, too, and I didn't speak to it or mention it, and it was very serendipitous for me. But I was thinking about this yesterday, that the whole notion of the ascetic aspect of Buddhism, and there are traces of the analogy of body without organs with meditation, is in fact that all of the ontology for dealing with suffering and the cessation of suffering through mindfulness practice is essentially a coping mechanism to deal with death. That all of the zeitgeist around a way of living, and that's why I feel like there may be a matrix of similarity with the goals of psychoanalysis. But this is basically speaking to that direct ontological or theological myth, the nirvana. You know, they say that that the Buddha is attributed to have experienced the deathless, finally achieved the deathless in nirvana. But yet, the very practice and the ethos can be thought of as really living a life towards finally being able to deal with the great leveler that's coming, the Maha great thing that is death that is upon us. So I just wanted
and also that we're experiencing it all the time, and it's I don't want to say it in some sort of Sylvia Plath, we're all dying all the time kind of thing, but that in our unconscious we actually have desiring machines that are going through the model, that see the model, go through the process, experience it, have breaks, that continue to move. I agree, Plath is awesome. I'm not saying she's not awesome. I'm saying I'm trying not to use the term in that Sylvia Plath way. I'm trying to, I think they have a different conception of this sort of model of death that's constantly happening for our desiring machines, and it's that moment that allows the repetition, the heat death, the moment there is no movement, the absence of desire. Those moments are things that we experience all the time. I really like that model. I really like that idea.
It goes back to what we were saying about the motor, or the movement. For movement to be possible, inertia must be there. It's always like back and forth of intensity. For intensity to rise, there's need to be a zero sum, like a zero plateau or whatever. Like it needs to be like a not a negation of its possibility, but like it's a, I don't know. It's like a, the sprinters, as they start sprinting, there's like a little block, and it allows them to propulse themselves into space. So that's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, at some point we probably should go into that blind show quote, but yeah, I think that's it though, is like if you think about the breast and like the mouth receiving the milk, right? Like it's not like it gets all the milk all at once, right? Like there's cuts of the flow, the process is working on itself to start by ending, and also to the constant endings, right? When they talk about becoming deaths, right? Like they're talking about that during these procedures, or like you're saying with the motor, it's going to sputter, it's going to, it's going to break while it's working, and that's part of how it works. Or like with a record, right? If you scratch the record, there's a way in which you're breaking it, but as you go to play it again, it's something will be produced new, won't it?
But just the record, the movement of the record under the needle, it's a breakage. It never stays at the same point. It's like breaking from one point to the other, and it's the addition or the linear continuity between these points that actually creates the music. So there's always like this interstice of like reading, not reading, reading, not reading.
Yeah, exactly. And it moves from groove to groove. It very quickly, right? Like just like you're saying, it's going around and around and around just within one groove before it goes to the next. So there's a lot of to use like an easy word, right? Like there's a lot of stopping during the movements.
I'm going to move us on to the next paragraph. If Freud needs death as a principle, this is by virtue of the requirements of the dualism that maintains a qualitative opposition between the drives. You will not escape the conflict. Once the dualism of the sexual drives and the ego drives has only a topological scope, the qualitative or dynamic dualism passes between Eros and Thanatos. But the same enterprise is continued and reinforced, eliminating the machinic element of desire, the desiring machines. It is a matter of eliminating the libido, insofar as it implies the possibility of energetic conversions in the machine, libido numen voluptas. It is a matter of imposing the idea of an energetic duality, rendering the machinic transformations impossible, with everything obliged to pass by way of an indifferent neutral energy, that energy emanating from Oedipus and capable of being added to either of the two irreducible forms, neutralizing, mortifying life. The purpose of the topological and dynamic dualities is to thrust aside the point of view of functional multiplicity that alone is economic. Zondi situates the problem clearly. Why two kinds of drives, qualified as molar, functioning mysteriously, which is to say audibly, rather than in genes of drives, 8 molecular genes, for example, functioning machinically? This makes a lot more sense when you actually read it in a proper order, this book, just letting you know. Because this paragraph now makes a lot more sense to me. I'm going to read the footnote on the impossibility of immediate qualitative conversions and the necessity for going by way of neutral energy. See Sigmund Freud, the ego, and the id. This impossibility, this necessity is no longer understandable, it seems to us, if one agrees with Jean Laplanche that the death drive has no energy of its own. Therefore, the death drive could not enter into a veritable dualism, or would have to be confused with the neutral energy itself, which Freud denies.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Because this desiring production is moving, right? The libido to numen to voluptas, right? Like, that moves in relation with the body without organs, but the body without organs doesn't bring energy into the mix.
Correct. The body without organs
if
is
I understand correctly.
the body without organs is inert. I think we would be the Uber particle, or I think I said ice 9. It touches things and those things become inert, just done. And so they don't have their own energy. But through the 3 syntheses, we see the conversions in the machine, that process. But if it doesn't have its own energy, what is it pulling energy from? It's pulling energy from what? Oedipus? And I think that's the final thing. They've got like this sarcastic statement from Zondi where they're like, why 2? Why stop at 2? Let's have thousands of different drives, which is actually kind of a fair point.
But that's the thing, because they're on one side, there's going to be the molar drives or the molar model, and then the molecular drives, which are always plural, always a multiplicity, but being cast into Oedipus, into one thing, a thing that doesn't move, that transcends every molecular drives. So basically, it reduces them, or like just eliminates them from the equation.
Yeah, exactly. It's the body without organs is either going to attract it and sort of appropriate or miraculate it, or it's going to repel them. But that is the relationship, and that's part of the distribution of that energy.
Well, and it makes a lot of sense to me because one of the things that they mention very clearly here is that the death drive doesn't really have its own. Like, if you have libido as an energy source, what is the energy source for the death drive? For Thanatos. And it's its own, sort of, but why do that? I'm understanding what they're saying, I think. Yeah, I'm with Ken. As Kent says, Lacan, I'm having trouble following this, I think, because I never really got super deep into Freud, and with Lacan, there is only libido. So Lacan kind of had a solve for that, at least somewhat, and death drive was very different for him. If one looks in this direction for the ultimate reason why Freud erects a transcendent death instinct as a principle, the reason will be found in Freud's practice itself. For if the principle has nothing to do with the facts, it has a lot to do with the psychoanalyst's conception of psychoanalytic practice, the conception the psychoanalyst wishes to impose. Freud made the most profound discovery of the abstract subjective essence of desire, libido. But since he re-alienated this essence, reinvesting it in a subjective system of representation of the ego, and since he recoded this essence on the residual territoriality of Oedipus and under the despotic signifier of castration, he could no longer conceive the essence of life except in a form turned back against itself, in the form of death itself. And this neutralization, this turning back against life, is also the last way in which a depressive and exhausted libido can go on surviving and dream that it is surviving. Quote, "The ascetic ideal is an artifice for the preservation of life. Even when he wounds himself, this master of destruction, of self-destructing, the very wound itself compels him to live. It is Oedipus, the marshy earth, that gives off a powerful odor of decay and death. And it is castration, the pious ascetic wound, the signifier that makes of this death a conservatory for the Oedipal life. Desire is in itself not a desire to love, but a force to love, a virtue that gives and produces, that engineers. For how could what is in life still desire life? Who would want to call that a desire? But desire must turn back against itself in the name of a horrible Ananke. The Ananke of the weak and the depressed, the contagious neurotic Ananke. Desire must produce its shadow or its monkey, and find a strange artificial force for vegetating in the void at the heart of its own lack. For better days to come? It must. But who talks in this way? What abjectness! become a desire to be loved, or worse, a sniveling desire to have been loved, a desire that is reborn of its own frustration. No, daddy, mommy didn't love me enough. Sick desire stretches out on the couch, an artificial swamp, a little earth, a little mother. Quote, look at you stumbling and staggering with no use in your legs, and it's nothing but your wanting to be loved which does it. A maudlin crying to be loved, which makes your knees go all ricky. End quote. Just as there are 2 stomachs for the ruminant, there must also exist 2 abortions, 2 castrations for sick desire. One in the family, in the familial scene with the knitting mother, another time in the asepticized clinic, in the psychoanalytic scene with specialist artists who know how to handle the death instinct and bring off castration, bring off frustration. This is just them shitting on psychoanalysis. And I don't understand the last sentence myself, Alyosha.
So imagine, like, spending 332 pages just waiting to, like, spit that out.
What do we make of the 2 thing? I'm just trying to understand. Just as there are 2 stomachs for the ruminant, there must also exist 2 abortions. So there's once in the family in the familial scene, and then another time in the clinic. So there's just like the double Oedipalization, I guess. But
Yeah, for like desire to be digested as grass is being digested by the cow, it needs to go into 2 different spaces, and those 2 different spaces are necessary for the full digestion of the grass. And then, desire to be corrected and to be castrated, it needs to be castrated within the family and then being castrated into the clinic. And without those 2 moments, it cannot be fully castrated.
okay, so I didn't realize that word is about animals. That ruminant.
It's a cow, yes.
That makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah, it just means cow.
But the ruminant is the depressed also. To be a ruminant about your own life is to like keep in a loop into your own problems. So it in French, it refers to that. So basically you're being a cow because you keep eating the grass and digesting it and like biting it off. And it's like an ongoing process of like biting onto the same thing.
I just want to mention that cows have 4 stomachs, not 2. I find that really important for some reason.
Wow,
It is a really weird thing for them to get wrong.
Maybe these are special French cows, Lou.
I want to ask about the last sentence where they use the terms, very much the last sentence. It's a long sentence, but I mean very end of it. In the psychoanalytic scene with specialist artists who know how to handle the death instinct and bring off castration, bring off frustration, generally speaking, this means to like finish off, to conclude, there's a lot of ways this is used as a phrase, but I don't understand. It doesn't mean to literally lift off castration.
No, I think they're doing it like it's like a magician, They're making the trick happen. They're bringing it out like I don't know, again, maybe what the original French is, but I'm reading it like once it's in the context after this like double Oedipalization or whatever, they can do the final stroke to make the lady look like she's been cut in half.
I'm gonna ask what it is in the French. Sorry, Roger, because I'm gonna be crude here. Bring off is like a colloquialism, especially during mid 19th century for jerking someone off to orgasm. Like that's what it means. It's that's what they used it for. It's a phrase. It's in a lot of books. I'm not making this shit up.
How do you know that?
I like old books, and it's a weird sort of thing in old Playboys. It's a phrasing that they used. It means orgasm, to like bring off, to jerk off. I like it. Fuck off, all of you people.
I was thinking if it was something like that. Yeah, it makes even more sense then.
It feels like orgasmic release is the intended. Yeah, books, whatever. Fuck off, you people.
Clearly, you actually did read the Playboys for the articles.
I did, and the women. I was like 10 when I first started, but like bring off castration, bring off frustration. I just am wondering, because that is a very distinctly English phrase, and it's in quotes. I'm wondering if in French they use something different, because that feels like a translator trick if that's the case.
Just go on. I'll find it.
Yeah, we'll read the next paragraph. And just to this paragraph ends at the bottom of the page for me. Is that accurate for everyone? I just always check with this PDF because it's wonky as shit. Okay.
It reads of the great death and the little ego.
Yep. Is this really the right way to bring on better days? And aren't all the destructions performed by schizoanalysis worth more than this psychoanalytic conservatory? Aren't they more a part of an affirmative task? Lie down, then, on the soft couch, which the analyst provides, and try to think up something different. If you realize that he is not a god, but a human being like yourself, with worries, defects, ambitions, frailties, that he is not the repository of an all-encompassing wisdom, but a wanderer along the deterritorialized path, perhaps you will cease pouring it out like a sewer, however melodious it may sound to your ears, and rise up on your own two legs and sing with your own God-given voice, Newman. To confess, to whine, to complain, to commiserate always demands a toll. To sing, it doesn't cost you a penny. Not only does it cost nothing, you actually enrich others instead of infecting them. The phantasmal world is the world which has not been fully conquered over. It is the world of the past, never of the future. To move forward clinging to the past is like dragging a ball and chain. We are all guilty of crime, the great crime of not living life to the full. It has to be Miller. It has to be Miller. Is that Miller?
That is Miller from Sepsis. One would do well to consent. I'm sorry, they actually wrote something. So after they mentioned Sepsis, they say one would do well to consult the exercises of comic psychoanalysis in Sepsis by Henry Miller.
There we go. To continue, you weren't born Oedipus. You caused it to grow in yourself, and you aimed to get it out through fantasy, through castration. But this, in turn, you have caused to grow in Oedipus, namely, in yourself. The horrible circle. Shit on your whole mortifying imaginary and symbolic theater. What does schizoanalysis ask? Nothing more than a bit of a relation to the outside, a little real reality. And we claim the right to a radical laxity, a radical incompetence, the right to enter the analyst's office and say, it smells bad here. It reeks of the great death and the little ego.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like this. That's a good paragraph. No, please go.
Oh, I was just gonna say that has like some of like the three like to me I like most like legendary lines in the whole text, like the you caused Oedipus to grow in yourself, the like shit on your theater, and it smells nasty in this therapist's office. I think I remember all of those. It's like the first time I read it.
It's some when they do it right. Like I think I've made this comment before that a lot of their writing is so incredibly dense, but sometimes when they do the more poetic side of things and the more direct, it comes across incredibly well. And this is to follow. Anytime you can follow Miller up with something that I feel is like equally as kind of lovely, like you've done okay. I guess you've done okay.
Before we go, to bring off in French would be to succeed. So to have a successful castration or a successful frustration. It's because it's réussir in the sense of realize, but it's to be succeeding into bringing into the actual.
Okay, so I'm glad I...
Yeah, that's the
It's like jerking off.
but that's the promise, right? And that's the promise that turns into a lie.
Isn't what they're bringing off in that paragraph like castration? This sort of I can't exactly remember exactly what they said. Yeah, castration, frustration, right? So it's like I feel like there's something with the artist because they mentioned like the shadow or its monkey, and I had to relook at it, but like Deleuze like writing about like Nietzsche will talk about like, you know, or like it just in there, but like, you know, he's the kind of caricature of like the affirmation, you know, the artist is like they're like the imitation of the one who like sings the song of life, and therefore they like represent this like danger, the greatest danger, because they imitate this sort of anti-Oedipus by like through and Oedipalize all the more.
I was thinking of it in terms of like the bringing off as being like it's supposed to be salient, but in the succeeding, like it does like there wasn't Oedipus, but it produces Oedipus, right? Like they get you to agree to it, and then like a passive synthesis, right? Like if that gets recorded and that, you know, there's a danger there.
What works? I'm going to continue to the next paragraph, unless anyone has more comments.
My comment would be that we are at the 2-hour mark, I think.
We are. Let me see. Yeah, let's go ahead and so how we'll handle this is we'll go ahead and take a break here. I think there's enough left that next Monday at noon Pacific time, we will continue through the rest of this section, and I think we'll finish it. And then Tuesday next week will be our review. Once again, a mega review of a very large section. Thank all of you for joining us. Please join us next Monday. Stick around, ask questions, do whatever you want. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream and end the recording. Thank you guys all for joining us. Bye-bye.
you